The movie opens to ice cream shop worker Cameron lying in bed with the beautiful blonde Diane. She begs him to call in sick at work so they can stay in bed all day and recreate the actions of last night before declaring their love for each other. He suddenly wakes up realizing it was just a wet dream. He comes down and his father Hunter is seen expressing his concern about his son's future plans after summer. Cameron is unsure about what he wants to do and prefers to spend his time collecting toys instead of focusing on school. Hunter insists that it's time for him to think about his future and sets a deadline for him to come up with an idea. Cameron gets on his bike and sets off to work. At the shop, his assistant manager Lenny tells him to close up at the end of the day, but Cameron says he can't because he has a date with Diane. Lenny scoffs, skeptical that the man managed to score a date with someone so beautiful, and tells him the only date he has is with his sock, with colleague Liz giving a demonstration. That afternoon, Liz waits outside expressing her annoyance that she now has to close the store because he wouldn't do it. Then she asks if he really has a date with Diane because she thinks Diane is out of his league. He explains that they've been friends for years and he's the first person she texted when she got back from college. But she doesn't believe him and he leaves. He stops by Diane's house and spies on her lounging in a bikini in the backyard getting wet by the sprinkler. He goes into fantasy mode again when suddenly Chad and Jason appear accusing him of secretly taking pictures of her. The bully grabs his phone and tosses it onto the street. Diane rushes over after hearing the commotion and asks what's going on. Chad says they saw Cameron taking photos of her. He denies it and can prove he wasn't. When he tries to retrieve his phone, a car runs over it smashing the screen. Diane's had enough and demands the bullies to leave. That evening, Cameron the pervert watches the young woman next door called Victoria undressing in her room. His mom walks in causing him to quickly close the curtains, and questions him why he's sitting in the dark. After she leaves, he turns off the light again and slowly opens the curtains to see the young woman looking back at him. At dinner, his dad Hunter tells him he's not going to buy him a new phone, and adds that he should have stood up for himself against the bullies who've tormented him for 3 years. Suddenly, the doorbell rings. Cameron gets up and goes to see who it is. When he peeks through the peephole, he starts to panic seeing it's the woman next door, but when he opens the door, all he sees is Diane. He has a puzzled look asking her if she saw anyone standing there when she walked up to which she didn't. The pair head off to a pizza parlor to grab some pizza. She apologizes for the broken phone telling him he's already seen her naked twice before. So why would he need a picture? But he doesn't recall that memory. Then he vaguely remembers the first time but not the second. Minutes later, Cameron's friend Martin walks in. Cameron waves for him to come over despite Diane asking him not to. Martin starts to stammer and can hardly put a sentence together seeing Diane and quickly excuses himself. Her annoyed reaction confuses Cameron, who doesn't know what he did wrong and leaves. After dropping him off at his house, Diane finally reveals she asked Martin to senior prom, even going to the extent of booking a hotel room in case things went well, but he stood her up and she still doesn't know why. To lift her spirits, he tells her he never would have stood her up if he was her date and asks about the second time he saw her naked. She recalls the night he came over to her house and they drank her father's tequila. She says she was going to share something personal with him that night, that he would have been her first. Suddenly he sees Victoria menacingly standing in the driveway, prompting him to rush back inside the house. Back in his room, he peeks through the curtains and sees her staring directly at him. To his surprise, she appears behind him asking him if it turns him on watching her undress. He hesitates and apologizes. He explains that their neighbor Miss Carpenter is usually the person he sees through the window. Victoria tells him she's house-sitting while she's away. When he opens the door to let her leave, she demands to drive her around town as punishment for peeping. Cameron reasons that he can't drive yet because he hasn't paid off the vehicle's insurance. The woman tells him to figure it out or she'll blab to his parents of what he's been doing. He gives in to her demand and drives her to an office building. She confiscates the car keys to make sure he doesn't abandon her there. She walks to the front entrance and a guy called Tony lets her in. Cameron gets fed up of waiting and decides to see what's going on. Suddenly, Tony limps toward the doors and begs for help. Confused and scared, Cameron runs back to the car and locks all the doors. Tony leaves bloody handprints on the windows as he continues begging. Victoria walks out and to Cameron's horror, he watches her bite into the man's neck, ending his life. He tries to escape but doesn't get far. She demands for him to get back in the car. On the ride back, he deduces that she's a vampire, and she threatens to kill him if he refuses to do as she says. Outside his house, Victoria thanks him with a kiss and tells him he needs to trust her. The next day, Hunter questions his son about the blood on the car. As he's about to explain, Victoria arrives just in time and makes an excuse telling him she saw an injured deer slam into the vehicle last night. Then she tells him that she knows all about the insurance issue with Cameron's car, and that she's willing to pay for the month's fee if he'll drive her around while she's in town. Despite Cameron's many excuses as to why he can't, his dad doesn't see anything wrong with the arrangement, much to Victoria's delight. Later at the ice cream parlor, Martin admits why he stood Diane up at senior prom. It's because her hotness freaks him out and makes him act stupid around her. He asks Cameron for his help to convince Diane to give him another chance. He will try but no promises. Later, Cameron meets with Diane and tells her everything what Martin told him. She thinks it's sweet that he acts all goofy around her and considers giving him a second chance, much to Cameron's disappointment. Later that night, Cameron the driver waits in the car while the vampire heads inside another building. Moments later, a person's lifeless body lands by the vehicle, freaking him out. Victoria returns to the car, satisfying her craving by licking the blood off her fingers. Before heading home, Cameron makes sure to wash the blood from the window at a gas station. Hours later, the vampire is lying beside him naked and proceeds to tell him why she's in town and needs his help. Victoria goes into story mode and tells him she's 247 years old. She was turned when she was 16. In the year 1890, a rival pack of vampires killed her lover when he refused to join them. She adds that over the last century, most of the pack members moved to America, a few of whom are in town, and she vowed to eliminate every last one. After learning that the people she's killed weren't human, a relieved Cameron asks why she didn't just tell him that from the start. Now he's all hyped to go vampire hunting. The next morning, Martin asks Cameron to tag along on his date with Diane because he's too nervous. Later, Lenny's in disbelief upon seeing his employee hanging out with Diane outside the shop and thinks he's paying her to hang out. That night, he asks the vampire how many she has left to eliminate. She tells him there's one tonight and another that she hasn't located yet. She explains that the final vampire is as old as she is and the one who killed Victoria's lover, and she vows to make the death as excruciating as possible. This time an excited Cameron insists on accompanying her into the building despite her ordering him to wait in the car. In the basement, she comes face to face with her target. He shoots at her, then at Cameron, who crumples to the floor. Seconds later, Victoria bites into the target's neck, easily defeating him. She rushes to Cameron's aid. He smiles and reveals he played dead to distract the other vampire. However, she admonishes him for the risky move which could have cost him his life. He needs to follow the rules or next time she won't be able to protect him. Before they part ways, this time he asks her for help, which is to drop by Martin and Diane's date tomorrow so he has an excuse to leave. As he agreed to accompany him, she agrees. The next day, Liz asks Cameron if he'd like to watch her friend's band play tomorrow night, but he politely declines. During the date, Cameron fills the awkward silence by sharing that Martin's trying out for a semi-pro baseball team this year, but when he says he needs to leave, both of his friends beg him to stay. Just as Diane goes to the restroom, Victoria arrives to pick him up as agreed. He introduces Martin, who again stutters at the sight of a beautiful young woman. Outside, the vampire asks who the woman is. Cameron explains that he's been in love with Diane since freshman year. She then asks who Martin is. He says the friend's in love with the same woman and he's helping out with their date. Perplexed, Victoria doesn't understand his methods. He tells her that the more time Diane spends with Martin, the faster she'll realize what a moron he is. That night, Victoria wants to see where he works. He spots bullies Chad and Jason, who are outside the ice cream shop, and tells her they've tormented him for years. She has a little fun and pretends to be Cameron's girlfriend and starts insulting the bullies. The confrontation causes Chad to square up against Cameron, and he lands several blows. Victoria calls a timeout and coaches him to hit the bully's ribs repeatedly, which he performs successfully. After Chad falls to the ground, the vampire concludes that due to the bully losing, they'll leave Cameron alone from now on, to which they agree. In the car, he's in pain and says he thinks his wrist is broken, so Victoria hands him a small pendant vial from her choker and tells him to drink it. After he ingests the substance, she reveals that it was her blood. Panicked, Cameron thinks he'll turn into a vampire. She assures him that it'll only help him heal faster. That night, he plays with himself whilst dreaming about Diane. Victoria appears in his bed asking if he wants a hand, and tells him the blood he drank acts as a male performance enhancer as well. Then she suggests they should do the deed to try and make Diane jealous. While they kiss, his dad barges into the room but quickly backs away when he realizes what's going on. She wishes to continue the intimate moment, but Cameron stops her and says he can't betray Diane. He's positive Martin and Diane's date went horribly and hoping he may now have a chance with her, which Victoria thinks is naive. The next day, the father gives his son a knowing smile as they sit across from each other at the table. Later, a frustrated Martin arrives telling Cameron that the date fell apart the second he left. Martin then asks him for help, but Cameron tells him straight that maybe things didn't work out because they aren't meant to be. Meanwhile, Victoria stops by the vintage clothing store where Diane works. After recounting the complicated web of romantic entanglements he finds himself in, Cameron tells Liz that he's done prioritizing other people's happiness over his, so he reconsiders Liz's invitation to watch her friend's band play later that night. Just as he's about to leave to meet up with Liz, he sees Diane's car parked outside the neighbor's house. Curious, Cameron peeks through the window and sees the love of his life hanging out with Victoria. As the women head upstairs, he sprints back to his house to spy on them from his bedroom window, watching in disbelief as they start making out. Seconds later, the vampire closes the curtains and turns off the lights as they get more intimate. The next day, he sees Diane leave the neighbor's house, proving that she spent the night. After she drives off, Victoria appears and asks if he enjoyed the show. He expresses his anger at her involving the one person he wishes she didn't, but Victoria snidely remarks she had to find out if Diane was insatiable and that it'll never work out between him and her. He threatens to reveal her true identity if she doesn't leave Diane alone. When he says he isn't working for her anymore, she menacingly grabs him by his shirt and states that he's in no position to start making threats and insists he do exactly as she asks. Later, as Martin is meditating, Cameron tells him that he needs to go on another date with Diane and he'll make sure it's a success this time, putting a wide grin on his face. He drops by the vintage clothing store needing a new outfit for a date. Diane tells him that Martin asked her out again but doesn't think he's boyfriend material. That afternoon, Carol hands her son a new phone but asks that he keep it a secret from his father for a few weeks. During the date, Cameron listens in on the conversation through an earpiece and Martin recites everything that he dictates. Diane notices the earpiece. He comes up with an excuse, or shall I say Cameron comes up with an excuse about an important call from the sports team and that the phone would be a distraction and his focus should be entirely on her. After the successful date, Diane hands Martin the car keys and tells him to take her anywhere he wants, much to Cameron's disapproval, and orders his friend to take her home, but he refuses to listen and plans on heading to Lover's Lane. Exasperated, Cameron drives to the same location to try and stop the date. Hiding behind a tree, he watches as Diane whispers into the earpiece and tosses it out the window, implying that she knew he was on the other end the entire night. However, instead of making love, she bites into Martin's neck, revealing her to also be a vampire. Cameron drives to the ice cream shop looking for Liz, but she isn't there. Seconds later, Diane appears. Cameron tells her to stay away because she just killed his friend. She says Martin's alive and shows him curled up in the trunk of the car, explaining she simply made him stronger from the bite to help him play professional baseball. Cameron expresses the betrayal he feels from all the years she kept her secret from him. She says she tried telling him that night in high school when he fell asleep after they got drunk. When he asks why she hasn't said anything in the 2 years since, she reason was that she was afraid he'd react the way he's reacting now. Then, she admits that she loves him even though she swore to never love again after witnessing every mortal she's cared for perish from old age. She explains that she never acted on her feelings toward him because it'll never work out due to her true nature. Then they share a kiss as Lenny looks on. Later that night, Victoria tells Cameron that she didn't know Diane was a vampire until she got a closer look, and that she chose not to tell him because she knew he wouldn't believe her. Then she reveals that the woman he loves is the elusive vampire she's been looking for all these years and that he's going to be the bait. Sensing that Cameron's in danger, Diane arrives at his house. Suddenly, Lenny jumps out from behind a tree, says he knows what she is, and threatens to tell everyone. She takes him down and feeds on his blood. Minutes later, she and Martin barge through the door to confront Victoria, who's taken Cameron hostage. The women engage in a fierce battle, and when Victoria lunges at Diane with a blade, the latter shields herself with a wooden tray and throws the vengeful vampire to the floor. While straddling Victoria, Diane forces her to listen to what happened a century ago. She says their packmaster was a vicious leader and she wanted nothing more than to escape. She met Victoria's lover, who told her that she'd be safe in their pack and even gave her his blood, but when her heartless master found out, he killed Victoria's lover. After hearing the truth, Victoria apologizes and is now delighted in the fact that she found a living pack member. They share a kiss and suggest rebuilding a family together. As they say their goodbyes, Cameron tells Victoria that he had fun killing bad vampires with her, getting emotional. He asks Diane why she has to leave. She tells him it's time for her to move on, and for him as well, as he still has his whole life ahead of him to live. He suggests they can have an amazing life together, but she tells him it's not possible and will see him again when he needs her. She gives him one last kiss before leaving. The movie ends with Cameron telling his parents his career plans, which is to become a writer focusing on vampires, lesbian vampires to be more specific. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more cool videos.